My name is Brandon Scoble, and today the topic I will be refuting is net neutrality. The argument was made by Alan Valdez, and he stated that ending net neutrality will negatively affect the American people. He supports this with secondary claims. 1, ending net neutrality will have a negative impact on current American students. 2, repealing net neutrality will ultimately hurt small businesses. And 3, loss of net neutrality will negatively affect the average American. While many of his claims are very possible and likely, I will be mainly focusing on the shortcomings of his reasoning and evidence that was provided. On to his first point, stating that ending net neutrality will have a negative impact on American students. He backs this by saying the ending of net neutrality will cause an increase in tuition and complicate online assignments for college students. The shortcoming of this supporting evidence is that all the information provided was merely speculation and hypothetical. The arguer failed to provide any sort of proof that these are likely to happen. No statistical data or expert commentary was provided to show the likeliness that this could happen. While the fear that repealing of net neutrality will favor certain internet sites and services, this can also be a potential benefit for the American educational system due to the fact that internet service providers can choose to provide faster services for educational purposes. According to an article from U.S. News in April of 2017 at a town hall meeting, President Trump said, "We're going to spend a lot of money and we're going to get some great talent having to do with education because there's nothing more important than education." This statement conveys how important education is to the current president's administration. Ajit Pai, who originally proposed the repealing of net neutrality, was appointed by President Donald Trump to be the chairman of the FCC. It is safe to assume that both these political figures share common ideas and agendas. Therefore, if the new laws against net neutrality favor certain sites and online services, they are more than likely to favor education services, such as online classes. In the case that the laws do not favor education, students will have to rely heavily on non-internet services to do papers and projects, and he makes the claim that this will make it difficult for college students, but I like to counter this saying that before the internet, students had to go to the library and use more reading material, so not to discredit the effectiveness of the internet and gaining information, just that it's not the only way in doing so. His next supporting claim states that repealing net neutrality will ultimately hurt small businesses. He uses an example of a small business owner who writes comic material as a source of evidence in an attempt to further his argument. He states that the small business owner is bound to his service provider, Spectrum, due to the fact that they're the only service provider that can provide fast enough internet for him to send his data to his clients. What he fails to provide is when this interview took place. The repeal of net neutrality took place on December 14th, which was 2 months ago. And as of today, there have been no actions taken forth after passing the bill. So this only happened 2 months ago and hasn't had any impact on internet services. With this said, it is very likely that this example, which was not stated in any of his sources in his bibliography, was probably from 2 months ago, before the bill had even been passed, meaning that there's real no correlation between this example and his claim. And if it did happen in the short window of these 2 months, there's been no evidence shown that has impacted internet services so far, so also doesn't correlate. In his last supporting claim, he states that the loss of net neutrality will negatively affect the average American. After looking at his references provided, he used information from an article titled 10 Net Neutrality Pros and Cons. The flaw in this choice of evidence is that the article contains points that contradict and counter his argument. This article also points out the impact net neutrality has on innovation, content, censorship, and pricing, and provides logical evidence for both sides of the argument. A supporting detail he provides was that low data users will pay just as much as high data consumers. The shortcoming of this is that it could be the opposite. If internet service providers choose to create media packages, such as like video and social, you're only obligated to pay for the ones that you want. So his argument is that low data users will use this or will pay the same price as high data users, but if it's in a package like that, you would only choose the packages that you need and lowering the price. So in conclusion, the argument made by Allen that ending net neutrality will negatively affect the American people has some decent points, but contains flaws in the reasoning and the evidence provided. There are aspects of repealing net neutrality that can be beneficial to some Americans. Thank you.
All right, the structural stuff is pretty good at the beginning. I think I'd be a little bit careful about going ahead and conceding that there are possible consequences and just say, we don't know what the consequences are. The question is, did the advocate adequately show that there are consequences and then make the claim that said that they failed to do so? The argument about students is okay. You got some general information here about everything being hypothetical. I like the fact that you are talking about the information that the advocate cited and suggesting that really it's speculative at best in these particular circumstances. Your response, I think, is a little problematic. The notion that Trump thinks education's important. Trump appointed by the FCC commissioner, and they're likely to have the same kinds of outlook on things. That's kind of that's a three-step process that you're getting there to suggest that it's unlikely that education is going to be affected in some way. I think that's as much of a stretch as what the advocate is presenting here. So I think there's got to be a better way to do this. One of the first things that you might do is point out that a lot of academic use of internet services existed before net neutrality was put into place, and the likelihood that those are going to disappear has never been demonstrated. And in fact, the substantial expansion of those things without the net neutrality rules existed. So we have empirical experience that undermines the advocate's claim based on what happened before. And then you do kind of make this other argument, which seems to suggest, well, even in the worst case scenario, if all of the colleges and universities are suddenly not having access to the internet anymore, which is not going to happen. I mean, let's face it, that's just not something that's going to happen. There might be some kind of restriction that's being put into place, but that it's all going to disappear. No, I just can't imagine a situation where that's going to happen. But let's assume that it is. Well, then you do have the backup argument that says, look, people could go to the library before. People learned before there was the internet. That's an okay press. Like I said, I just think that it concedes something that is so unlikely that it's not really necessary to make that argument. I think the better argument is to look at what our experience was before the net neutrality rules existed. On the second argument, I think that you do kind of criticize the singular example that the advocate's presenting here, suggesting that it might be a little bit problematic. You seem to suggest that the reason that this argument might be specious is because it happened within the window between when the net neutrality rules existed and when they didn't exist. I don't know that that's the best answer on that. I think there's a better argument that suggests, like you said, that it is pretty much speculative on this issue. It's a singular example, and we don't even know if it existed under the net neutrality rules. Those are okay. I think that summarizes what that argument is on that particular point. I think on the third point that you have a legitimate counterclaim here that there could be potential benefits to consumers of getting rid of net neutrality, because then people could be priced on the basis of what they use rather than on what everybody uses. And I think there are analogies that you could draw to this to other parts of the economy. For instance, people with high insurance risks paying more than people who have low insurance risks. Everybody seems to think that that's pretty reasonable, that everybody shouldn't be paying the same price here. But there's a little bit of a value argument that's being presented here, and I think that's one of the issues that in a larger context would be discussed, but is not necessarily applicable here. All right, thank you.